So after wishing everyone a good Isru Chag and a gesunden Winter, now we're on Daf Yud Gimel, and you'll see approximately, again, I don't know if everyone has the same style of Gemara that I have, approximately 12 lines down from the top. And the first word in the line is Erva in my Gemara, my edition. And the Gemara quotes the Mishnah, Ketzad im Meis. So I'm going to read the entire Mishnah that's relevant to this piece of Gemara. We started this like on Erev Yom Kippur, but it's been a while, and we didn't finish it, so we have to finish. I'm eager to get to the Mishnah, maybe even beyond the Mishnah. It says, Ketzad im Mesu hein tzarasein mutaros. What would be a case where in Mesu, if you had a situation where, let's say, Ruvain dies, and Ruvain's daughter, let's say Ruvain dies and he has two wives. One wife is an erva to his brother Shimon, and the other is a tzara. So not only is the erva excluded from Yibum and Chalitza, so too the tzara is, unless, the Mishnah says, in Mesu, if let's say the erva died before the Nefila for Yibum, so that when Ruvain died, the only woman who fell for Yibum to Shimon was the tzara of the erva. So the erva never actually fell for Yibum to Shimon. Ketzad, so the Mishnah asks, give me an example of that. And the Mishnah says, Haisa bito, o achas mikol arayos ha'elu, nesuos liachid. So that Reuven was married to the daughter of Shimon. He married his niece. And now what happens is Reuven is married to another woman besides the daughter of Shimon. If the daughter of Shimon dies, and then Reuven dies, so the Sarah will fall for Yibum to Shimon because she's not in Sarah's Erev, insofar as the fact that Bito, or whatever Erev it was, died before the Nefila for Yibum. So this Gemara is going to analyze the following issue. Was there a moment in time in which both the Erva and the Sarah were married to this Reuven, to the same husband? Was there an overlap? Because one could ostensibly argue, as we'll see as the sugya develops, that if there was an overlap, then at one point that Sarah became a Tzara's Erva. The fact that subsequently the Erva died is irrelevant. Or do we say no? All we care about is the Shas Nefila. It doesn't matter if first, let's say Reuven married the daughter of Shimon, or let's say it the other way around. Let's say first Reuven married, we'll call her Rivka, a tzara. And then he married the daughter of Shimon, who's an erva to Shimon. Even in that case, if the daughter of Shimon dies before Reuven dies, before the Nefila for Yibum to Shimon, then at the moment of the Nefila, all we have in the picture on the horizon is only the tzara, and therefore she's Mesiabebus. So let's analyze the language of the Mishnah. Again, the Mishnah says, "V'lo isha cheres umesa bito." He has another wife, and then his daughter dies. And it would seem that first he married the tzara, that other woman, and then he married the daughter of Shimon. Afterwards, the daughter of Shimon died, or alternatively, he divorced the daughter of Shimon. And it would seem that from our Mishnah, the tzara is muteres, she falls for Yibum and Chalitza. The afilu, now we're reading the Gemara inside here. Again, if anyone came a little bit late, so we're on Daf Yud Gimel Amid Aleph, and we're approximately shall we say, 12 lines down from the top of the Amud. V'afilu kanas, in other words, he married the Tzara, Ulvasof, and afterwards, he married the Erva, he married the daughter of Shimon, and Gerish, and then he divorced the daughter of Shimon. Even in such a case, there would be a nefila for Yibum, for the Tzara, because again, at the moment when Ruvain died, the Tzara falls for Yibum without the Erva, because Ruvain, during his lifetime, obviously, had already divorced the Bas of Shimon, the Erva of Shimon, so that when the Tzara falls for Yibum to Shimon, she doesn't share a Tzara relationship with an Erva. And that's the way we learn our Mishnah. The Gemara is quite convinced that this is the pshat in our Mishnah. And all that would be fine and dandy, except for a Mishnah later on Daf Lamed. We're on Daf Yud Gimel, so we're fast forwarding approximately 27 blot. We're on 17 blot, I should say, right? So now we're on Daf Lamed. We're already on page 30. For a minu, I'm going to ask you a contradiction from a Mishnah later on. And again, all this is going to be based on an analysis of the Mishnah. A diuk in the Mishnah. Shlosha achim. So there are three brothers. We'll call them Ruvain, Shimon, and Levi. They have the same father, Yaakov, whatever. Nayim mehem nisuos shtei achos. So two of them are married to sisters. We'll call them Rachel and Leah. So let's say Ruvain is married to Rachel and Shimon to Leah. The Echad Nasui Nachas. And the third brother, Levi, is married to, we'll call her Sarah. Sarah is not related neither to Rachel nor Leah. So two brothers are married to two sisters, and the third brother is married to a Nachas, in the language of the Mishnah. Nachas meaning she's not a sister. It's not like three brothers married three sisters. That's also going to be a Mishnah later on. But now we're talking about two brothers marrying two sisters, and the third brother is married to a Nachas. Okay, so far so good. Now what happens? Geresh echad mibali ha'achios es ishto. Now watch this, the sequence here. It's very important. So one of the two brothers who are married to two sisters divorces his wife. Let's see, I think he has it somewhere down here in a diagram. I don't know which diagram it is. I think it's the one on the right. Maybe it's the one in the middle. And let's see, who divorced who? Let's see, Ruvain, Shimon, Levi, Achim, Leah is Achios, Nasa Ruvain, es Rachel, Shimon, Nasa Levi, es Leah, Levi, Nasa Sarah, the Gire Shimon es Leah. Okay. So Shimon, if you remember, was married to Leah. And now Shimon divorces Leah. Then what happens? Umes. And Shimon dies without children. So Shimon is married to Leah and he dies. Vikansa Hamagarish Umes. So now we're back to Ruvain. One second. So again, what happens is, I'm sorry, I skipped two words. That's what got me. Umes Hanosi Lenachos. Levi, who was married to Sarah, died without children. And now Shimon, who had divorced his wife Leah, is miyabem Sarah. Umes. And now Shimon, after being miyabem Sarah, dies. And what happens now? We have a third brother, Reuven, right? Because Levi died, Shimon married Levi's wife, Sarah, and now Shimon dies. But Shimon had earlier divorced his wife, Leah. So when Sarah falls for Yibum to Reuven after Shimon's death, she's no longer at Sarah's Erev, because although Leah was the sister of Reuven's wife, Rachel, but nevertheless, Leah's out of the picture because Leah had already received a divorce from Shimon. So I'm going to read to you again the translation here of the Masechet. He says, we called him Reuven, es hanocher sazu shenofla me'echav, me'achiv. So in other words, now Shimon, who was miyabim Sarah, Shimon's wife Sarah now falls to Yibum to Reuven, and Reuven will be miyabim Sarah or give a chalitza, but in other words, she falls to Yibum. And why is this? Because Sarah was never a tsaras erva. Why? Because Sarah was married to Levi. She had no other wives that were married to Levi in this scenario. And by the time Levi died, Shimon had already divorced his wife Leah. So that when Shimon is miyabim Sarah, Sarah is not at Sarah's erva because Sarah did not overlap with Leah as two wives of Shimon at any moment in time. So that when Shimon dies, clearly Sarah falls for Yibum to Reuven. This Mishnah that we're quoting reflects back on our Mishnah, the first Mishnah in the Masechet Yevamot, as the example of a case of Mesu o Nisgarshu Sarasein Misyabmos. So the Gemara now is medayik from this Mishnah Daf Lamed. Taimo, the reason why Sarah we called it Sarah, that she was the Nachris, is allowed to be misyabemes to one of the husbands of the sisters, meaning in this case Reuven, who's the husband of Rachel, is the girech because Shimon had already divorced his wife Leah before the Tzara came into the picture, meaning v'rak acher kach konas. Only afterwards, after Shimon had divorced Leah, then and only then did he marry Sarah, who fell for Yibum from Levi when Levi died. So in other words, the status of Sarah was such that she was never a tsaras erva. She could have been a tsaras erva had Shimon not divorced his wife Leah. But Shimon divorced his wife Leah well in advance of Levi's death and Shimon's marriage, or Yibum, if you want to call it, to Sarah. So Sarah never had the status, any moment in time, of a tsaras erva. And that's the case, the scenario that the Mishnah went out of its way to present as an example of Imesu on his Garshu, Sarah saying Mutaros. why did the Mishnah have to go that far? Unless it's indicating that Avol, that the din would change in a case of Kanas, the Achkak Gerish. Had the sequence been, if you play around with the sequence a little bit, change the events, and let's say that Levi died, his wife Sarah fell the Yibum to Shimon. Shimon was Miyabed Sarah, and he's still at this moment married to Leah. Then Shimon divorces Leah, then he dies. In such a case, there will be no Yibum between Sarah and Reuven. And the reason for that is because at one moment in time, Sarah already had the status of Itzaras Erva, because she was sharing, so to speak, Shimon with Leah, who's an Erva to Reuven as Achos Ishto. Even though immediately after that marriage of Shimon to Sarah, after that, Shimon had divorced his wife, Leah, which means that at the moment that Shimon dies, Sarah is not at Sarah's Erva. Why didn't the Mishnah give me that example? The implication of the Mishnah is that only because the gerushin of Shimon to Leah took place before the Yibum of Shimon to Sarah, therefore Sarah does not have the status of a Sarah's Erva, implying that had there been a moment in which Leah, together with Sarah, were married to Shimon, and therefore Sarah already was marked, I don't know what word to use, was already given the status of the Tzaras Erva, then even though subsequent to the marriage between Shimon and Sarah, Shimon divorced his wife Leah, she already at that moment, before the Gerushin, 1 second before the Gerushin of Shimon to Leah, Sarah had the status of the Tzaras Erva. Lo means that there's no Yibum. So now what we have is, we have two Mishnayos, each one with a diuk. I mean, neither of the Mishnayos address this question head on explicitly, but by implication, you derive two contradictory conclusions from the two Mishnayos. Because from our Mishnah, it seems that everything depends upon the Shas Nefila. And it makes no difference when the Gerushin between the deceased and the Erva took place, as long as it took place obviously before his death, then there was no Nefila of Itzaras Erva, so to speak. Whereas the other Mishnah on Daf Lamed gives us the opposite conclusion. The implication is that if at one moment in time the Sarah had the status of Itzaras Erva, even if subsequently she was divorced or she died, the status, the stigma of Tzaras Erva remains forever and forever, and there is no Yibum. So the word Tavra is kind of like one of those methodological terms in the Talmud, means I'm going to break it into half. When you have a contradiction, there are many different ways of reconciling the contradiction. One is to say, let's break it. Break it means, don't ask me from this Mishnah onto this Mishnah, because the author of this Mishnah had one opinion, and of this another. There's a different author of the. Sometimes we learn Mishnayos and we assume it's all one. Like my Rebbe, when there was a stira between a Rambam in Mishnah Torah and the Rambam in Pirush HaMishnayos, so the Rav used to say it's Machlokas Rishonim, even though it's all the Rambam. But it was the Rambam at age 30 when he wrote the Pirush HaMishnah, and the Rambam at the age of 60 when he wrote the Mishnah Torah. They're two different Rishonim. Anyway, Omer Rabbi Yirmiyah Tavra, Misha Shana Zo, Lo Shana Zo. Two different Tanon. Hi Tana, the Tana of our Mishnah, who allows Yibum in the case of a Tzaras Erva even if at one moment there was no divorce of the niftar, right? The one who before his marriage to the tzara. So there was a moment of time in which both the tzara and the erva were married together with, we'll call him Shimon. Savar, he's of the opinion, Misa Mapeles. There's no discussion about Yibum until after the death nebuch of the brother without children. And let's analyze the situation at that moment in time. This is the more complicated Shita, is the Tana of the Mishnah on the Aflamet. Savar, he's of the opinion that Nisuin Arishonim Afilu, that although the actual Nefilah, we'll call it Befar, takes place with Misa, and there was no Nefilah before Misa, so you and I would have said there's no Yibum to talk about. But the answer is the Yibum is based on Nisuin. I mean, all of Yibum is based on marriage. Right? So in a case where Shimon dies and his wife falls for Reuven for Yibum, it's because of the marriage relationship. It's everything in here is that the seed is sown in the marriage, in the Nisuin. And Mapilin means that although the final, Makav Patish, the actuality of Yibum takes place in Misa, but that Misa is only a reflection of what was generated by the marriage relationship. And if this Tzara, at the moment of the marriage between so-and-so and his Erva, she was a Tzara's Erva, then at that moment, the Nisuin itself precludes her from Yibum, because by virtue of the fact that she has an Nisuin together with an Erva to the same man who ultimately died and his wife's fall for Yibum, well, actually only one wife is fall for Yibum because he divorced the Erva, but nevertheless, already inherent in the Nisuin of the Tzara to this Shimon, she was a Tzara's Erva. Rav is not happy. The Olam Chad Tanim. I don't need Tavra. I don't need to break it up into two Tanoim. But Vizo, the Ein Tzarech Lomer Zoket. In other words, that sometimes the methodology of Rebbe is to tell you the bigger Chiddush first. Usually, classic is Zo, the Afilu Zo. I'll tell you the lower Chiddush first, and then I'll gradually build up till the bomb, when I drop the bomb. You follow me? But sometimes it goes the other way around. And is Zo V'Eitzarch Omer Zo. It's this one, which is the more radical extension. And certainly it goes without saying, we say in Yiddish, upgrade the other one. The lesser Chiddush comes last. Again, if, the scholars probably, I assume, would probably write books, because Rebbe was the greatest editor of all times. Rebbe is always considered on the pedestal, Maybe David HaMelech was greater, but except for David HaMelech, there was no editor or writer that was greater than Rebbe. So why would sometimes Rebbe tell me the lesser Chiddush and then build up to the greater Chiddush, Zu Vafilu Zu, and sometimes Rebbe chose the other way, Zu V'Ein Tzarech Lomer Zu, and he tells you the bigger Chiddush first in terms of the sequence. But the latter is the approach that we were plugging in here according to the Rav. The first Mishnah is telling me the greater Chiddush, meaning that there will be Yibum, even though the Tzara at one point in time during her Nitzuin relationship was in fact vis-a-vis Reuven the Yavam, a Tzaras Erva for Reuven. And even in that case, there will be Yibum, because at the time of the Nefilah, the Misa, by the time Shimon died, he had already divorced the Bas of Shimon, and the Sarah now falls for you. How much more so, it goes without saying, that if Shimon had divorced the Erva of Reuven, the Bas of Reuven, before he married this Sarah, how much more so would there be Yibum in that case? And, just in sum, I would say Rabbi Yirmiyah's approach has its problem because we're very uncomfortable with this concept of Nisuin Rishonim Apilim. On the other hand, Rava's approach has sort of a literary fallback or drawback in that you have to apply the principle of Zu v'ein tzarich lomer zu. And now we start the brand new sugya. This one, which will take us to the Mishnah, I don't think maybe we scratched the surface of it, but that's about it. We have what's called Kiddushay D'Rabbanan, otherwise known as Kiddushay Miyun, in a case where it wasn't the father who married off his daughter Ketana. The father's out of the picture, never, and instead one of her brothers or maybe her mother chose to marry her off. And she's a Ketana, which means she's a Bas Miyun. Now, the way Miyun works is it's Oker the Kiddushin L'Mafreya. Miyun operates retroactive. And you and I would therefore assume that in the case of an erva falling for Yibum, in a marriage of Miyun, together with a tzara, that tzara would not be a tzaras erva if there's Miyun. Why? And again, it has nothing to do with the previous sugya. This is totally independent. Because once there's Miyun and we remove the marriage L'Mafreya, therefore, the status of the tzara was never, ever that of a tzaras erva. So if this katana is an erva, and she was married off by her mother, let's say, to one of the brothers, once she's mama'enes in that brother, she was never married to him. And even though she's an erva to another brother, the tzara of that brother is not a tzaras erva. That would be the assumption. And the Mishnah says the following: Kol sheyechol l'mayim below miyana. The Gemara doesn't quote the entire Mishnah. Tzarasa choletzes below misyavenes. If there was no miyun, then the tzara is considered a tzaras erva based on a rabbinic marriage, an ishus d'Rabbanan. She's the tzara of an erva who's married with an ishus d'Rabbanan, and there was never a miyun. And this can be a problem. What do you mean there was never a miyun? Who cares? Let there be miyun now, because miyun works on my friend. But again, I'm jumping the gun a little. But that's what the Mishnah says. Now, why is there no yibum? That's because the Rabbanon were machmir, and the Rabbanon, they are going to consider it as if this tzara was a tzaras erva, despite the fact that the entire ishus to this erva is only the Rabbanon. The Rabbanon recognize that ishus, but they're only going to go so far, right? They're only going to say, well, she's a tzaras erva, and therefore there's no yibum. They're not going to undermine chalitza because really there's yibum in our Torah, because the Torah doesn't recognize this marriage of a katana because she wasn't married off by her father. So now the Gemara wants to know the following. It seems that the Mishnah puts the emphasis, the critical question in terms of whether or not there could be yibum in the case of a tzaras mima'enes, is whether or not at the time of the death of the brother, there was miyun or not. So let's give it names. Let's see if we... I think here the picture is on the next page. For those who have a Masifta, Mitch is here, he has a Masifta. I think, John, you also have a Masifta, right? So if you just for a moment turn the page, and the only reason we're doing this is because the diagram, I guess, couldn't fit in on the page. You know, the editors were not able to plan the page properly. So the picture that we need happens to be on the next page. So that's called Yud Gimel Beis in brackets. So it's number Kuf Chav. So we have here Ruvain and Shimon are brothers. And Ruvain has a bas, and she's very young. And it seems from this diagram that that Ruvain, 1 second. Reuven is married to Sarah. Just let me give you a minute to get the names right. Reuven is married to Sarah. And now he marries her off. Okay, I'm not sure exactly why we need all this information, but I guess it'll fit into place. So he says that Reuven marries off his daughter Sarah to Avram. Okay, once Reuven marries his daughter off to Avram, he's out of the picture, Reuven. Okay, now Avram, so that's Kiddushay Torah. Now Avram divorces Sarah. Okay, so at this point, Shimon marries Sarah. Now watch what happens. When Shimon marries Sarah, that marriage is the Rabban by definition. Why? Because Reuven, the father of Sarah, had married off his Ketana, Sarah, to Avram. Once he does that, he's out of the picture. So any marriage of Sarah, as long as she's a Ketana, will be only D'Rabbanan. So Shimon now marries Sarah following the divorce of Avram of Sarah, because again, even though she's a Ketana, she needs a get because she was married off by her father Reuven. And now Shimon is married to Sarah, Kiddushay D'Rabbanan, Kiddushay Mir, and she's the daughter of Reuven. Now Shimon dies, but before he dies, he married also another woman named Rivka. She's the Tzara in this. So Reuven has two wives, Sarah and Rivka. Sarah is Bas Avram, and Rivka is a Nachas. But keep in mind that the marriage between Shimon and Sarah is only D'Rabbanan. It's Kiddushay Mir. And now Shimon dies. So Sarah falls for Yibum to her father, Reuven, together with Rivka, the Tzara of Shimon. The Tzara of Sarah. And it would seem from the Mishnah that in this case, since Sarah was not Mima'enes, and Shimon died, there's no Yibum to Rivka, the Tzara of Sarah. So the Gemara asks, I don't get it. V'tumayin hashta. Why don't we tell her right now, at this moment, to be Mama'enes? Which is, again, it sounds very paradoxical. What do you mean to be Mama'enes? To Mama'enes to who? Her husband, Shimon, is dead already. He writes here, Umei Shimon below Bonim, V'naflas Sarah l'fnei Reuven avia liyibum, Yachan and Rivka tzarasa, Valzeh limdonu b'mishnah, sheRivka choletzes. Meaning the tzara cannot fall for Yibum. Kevish Minat Torah. Oh no, why does she need chalitza at all? Minat Torah, Ein Tzaras Erva, Sherei Nesue Sarah, Hein Midrabana. That's because, Reuven took himself as a father out of the picture of marrying off his daughter Ketana because he had already married her off to Avram. Avram divorced her. And now when Shimon marries her, Reuven is out of the picture. So if Reuven's out of the picture, then what we have is the Nesue D'Rabbanan. That father Rabbanan insisted that we recognize this marriage, and therefore there's no p'tur of Saras Erva. Again, we're not going to allow Yibum, but we'll require Chalitz. U'maksha Gemara, v'temayin Sora Achsha. A little bit odd, no? I mean, Shimon is gone. V'tomar, any chafetza b'kiddushin shekitshuri achi v'imi l'Shimon v'te'aker mitach l'mafreya es nisuel l'Shimon. Wow. So this is like what? Posthumous mute. They kach tuchal Rivka tzarosel isyabe merumen. Sharei yisbarer shlo hoyse tzaras erva beola. Sharei miyun okes hanisulim afreya. We mishnasenu nira sherivka asura l'isyabe b'cholof and afilim t'mayim achshav. Notice our Mishnah puts all the emphasis on the critical moment of death. And if during his lifetime Shimon did not receive miyun, meaning what's her name, Sarah was not Mimaenes, then at that moment Rivka is a Taras Arab, because again, Sarah is the daughter of Reuven. So when Shimon dies, the daughter of Reuven falls in front of Reuven together with the Tzar. The Tzar is now a Taras Arab. Why? Gemara says, why is the Mishnah putting all that emphasis on the Shas Misa? Let her be Mimaenes now and be Oker, the marriage of Mafreya, making it as if Shimon was never ever married to the daughter of Reuven. Utmoin hashta v'tisyabe tzarasa lema misayeh leila Rabbi Oshia. So now the fundamental issue about miyun is subject to a machlokes at the end of Masechet Yevamot on Daf Kuf Zayin between Beit Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beit Shammai are of the opinion that Mima'enes b'Baal v'lo b'Yavam. Meaning, we ask the question, how is it possible for Sarah to be Mima'enes after Shimon's death? Sarah was married, albeit in a Kiddushay D'Rabbanan, to Shimon. Shimon is gone already. During his lifetime, she wasn't Mima'enes. But the answer is that in the context of Yibum, her husband Shimon is, in inverted commas, still alive. Why? Zikas Yibum is a continuation of the Ishus of Shimon that now impacts upon Reuven. So the miyun now is going to be a yibum on the miyun is going to be a miyun on the yavam, which in this case is her own father, Reuven. And that's the sheet of Beit Shammai. Beis Hillel holds that Mima'enes bein b'Baila bein b'Yavama. The Yavama, or Yavam, meaning Mapike, like the Yavam, is basically Haba through the mechanism of Zika in a Yibum situation where he died without any children. Hence, we have a situation of miyun, a viable miyun, and that miyun is chal on the Yavam. But it matters not, because of our problem. Once there is Yibum, once there is miyun is oker the Kedushin Mafreya, which means that Shimon, in effect, was never ever married to Sarah. You would have said, well, wait a minute, she's being Mima'enes in Reuven, the Yavam, because of the Zikas Yibum. That's not a miyun that's chal vis-a-vis Shimon. But it doesn't matter. Once the miyun is chal, if it's a viable miyun, even though the technical implementation of that miyun is to the live brother, meaning the Yavam, in this case, Reuven the father, but nevertheless, it's Oker L'Mafreya, the marriage to Shimon, because we view this as all one continuous issues. Okay, now Let's analyze the Shita Beis Hillel. Amar Rabbi Oshia, Mima Enes Lema Moro, V'ena Mima Enes L'Zikas. There is no such thing, even according to Beis Hillel, of a miyun that will undermine Zikas Yibum, says Rav Oshia. I mean, again, we're going to have to see according to Rav Oshia. So, what exactly do Beis Hillel mean when they say "Mimayenes bein b'ba'al u'bein b'yavam"? But for our purposes, we're going to cross out the word to bein b'yavam, which again is going to raise the issue. So, what did Beis Hillel say, and how did they argue against Beit Shammai? But in any event, we're going to focus our attention on Beis Hillel according to Rav Oshia. Mimayenes lama moro. Now, to make life complicated in issues, there's such a thing called maimar. What is maimar? Maimar means that a woman falls for yibum, and according to the Torah law, there are two options. Either he's miyavim her with bia, or he gives her chalitza. But the Rabbanan have a third option, which is called maimar, which the Torah doesn't even recognize. And what's maimar? If the yavam, instead of implementing yibum and or chalitza, he decides to be makadesh the yavam, and he declares harei at mekudeshes li, and he gives her whatever he gives her. So that's called mamara. Now, if the Rabbanan recognize the validity of maimar, then in effect, she would need a get to get out of that relationship. It wouldn't be enough to give chalitza, because chalitza could remove zikas yibum, but it can't remove a marriage relationship. So if the Rabbanan are going to validate the maimar and give it a status of halacha, then she would need a get. Here's the chiddush of Beis Hillel, according to Rav Oshia, that mimayenes l'mamor, that despite the fact that he gave her kiddushin, which in our minds would necessitate a get, how to get out of this relationship, she doesn't need a get. All she needs is miyun. So it's an amazing thing here, because this miyun is going to be effective not only vis-a-vis the marriage relationship, the ishus itself, which is generated by zikas yibum, it takes on the form of zikas yibum, but the miyun is going to be effective even as far as the maimar is concerned, where maimar always would generate a need for a get. Here, in this case, she's a ketana, and instead of a get, all we need is maimar. So that the maimar itself, all we need is miyun. So the maimar itself doesn't really change anything. Just like miyun would have been effective without maimar, it's effective even after the maimar. Now, if the miyun is effective, then it should be effective on the zika relationship, and therefore it's as if she was never married to Shimon, right? Shimon is the one who died. But the enam enes zikasa, according to Rav Oshi's interpretation of Beis Hillel, there is no effective miyun on the zika. Why is that so? So on that we have a diagram. But before we get to the diagram, let's just read the words. Lefisha eina miyun moil el afkias maisa nase ba al yidei adam. Miyun is ineffective on zika, according to Rav Oshi's interpretation, because zika is very unique. Zika creates issues without a maisa. There was no Maisa Kiddushin. And even though we said that miyun is effective on maimar, which is also a form of Masechet Yevamot, but not on the Zika itself. The Zika is something that is created memela automatically. It emerges without a Maisa. There was no Kiddushin for the Miyun to be Chal on. Miyun was created as an entity, as an institution, a legal way of breaking up an actively created Maisa Kiddush. Lefisha Eina Miyun Moel El Afkia es Maisa Nasiba Al Yidei Adam Kigon Kiddushin or Maimar. Amal Ein Koch Biad Miyun Lafkia es Zikasa Liyibum Chalitza Kishenasim Bidei Shamayim. Because we talk about Zika, which is an Ishus relationship that is generated without a Maisa Adam, or rather Bidei Shamayim. On such a Zika, there is no Miyun. Again, it's all strange over here because we're dealing with D'Rabbanans. I mean, the whole institution of marriage in this case, and therefore Zikas Yibum, is all D'Rabbanan. But we're saying that once the Rabbanan recognized this marriage, and now in the aftermath of the death of Shimon, there's a Zika relationship to Ruvain. That Zika on a Rabbanan level is so powerful that the Rabbanan will not recognize Miyun because the Ishus is created b'din Shamayim. It's a mud nazach. You're talking about Ishus created min Shamayim when the whole institution is the Rabbanan. Okay. Eina muteres lashuk below chalitza. Since the Miyun is not going to be effective to remove the Zika, then the only method which can remove the Zika is chalitza. That's the opinion of Rav Oshia. Now, who disagrees with Rav Oshia? Again, this is at the end of Masechet Yevamot. That's Ula. Ula Amar Mima'enes af lizikasa. To the same extent that in Ishus the Rabbanan that's created b'dei Adam, the Rabbanan recognize the efficacy of Miyun, so too in the case of Ishus the Rabbanan that's created min Hashamayim, namely Zika, Miyun is effective. And that was the paradox that we mentioned earlier of Beis Hillel, and now it's really coming to the fore, according to Ula's interpretation of Beis Hillel, that there's such a thing as being b'ma'enes on Zika, and that's going to impact l'mafreya on her relationship to the deceased, the late brother. And if that be the case, then the Sarah will fall for evil. And the Gemara's kasha would be a very shver kasha. Why does the Mishnah say it all depends on whether she was Mama'enes during his lifetime before he died? Let it be Mama'enes after he died. Because there's Miyun on Zika, and the Miyun on Zika will now be acknowledged or recognized as a legal, full-fledged, binding, effective Miyun that now removes the Ishus to the original brother, we'll call him Shimon, Limafreya, retroactive. And that's against our Mishnah. V'hainu mishum, shamiyun oker es nisue abal harichonim lafreya. Interesting. How does Ula solve or address this paradox? There's miyun posthumously that's going to remove l'mafreya her relationship to the previous husband when the miyun takes place posthumously. How does that work? And the answer is that although the Maisa miyun is vis-a-vis the Yavam, but really, in terms of the chalos miyun, the efficacy of the miyun, it's on the ishus that generated the zika. And that means the ishus of Shimon during its lifetime. In other words, once, according to Ula, Beis Hillel recognized the validity of miyud posthumously in a Yibum situation, what they're in effect saying is that the miyud operates on the Zika. Well, wait a minute. As we just saw in the Shita Rav Oshia, how could it be possible that the miyud would be effective on Zika when Zika is an Ishus Bidei Shamayim? But the answer is that Zika Bidei Shamayim is rooted in the original marriage relationship of Shimon to Sarah. And therefore, the Zika, by definition, according to Ulo, would have to be effective on the original marriage. If Beis Hillel accepts a miyun on Zika, then it's got to be a miyun on the Ishus that generated Zika. Why? Because Zika is Ishus Bidei Shamayim. And there is no miyun on Ishus Bidei Shamayim. Even Ula admits to the fundamental underlying principle of Rav Oshia. There's no such thing as miyun on Ishus Bidei Shamayim. How could Ula therefore recognize the efficacy of miyun on Zika? The answer is because Zika itself is nothing more than an extension of the original Ishus, which was an Ishus Bidei Adam. And therefore, the miyun now posthumously is going to impact on that which is the basis of the Zika. What's the basis of the Zika? The original Ishus. Hainu michucha miyun oker es nisui abal harishonim lemafreya u'memela lo nizkika me'olam li'afin. She never fell for Yibum to Reuven, her father, right? Because if we're going to be oker the kedushin between Sarah and Shimon lemafreya, it means that Shimon was never married to Sarah. Hence, there was never Yibum. There was never a zikas even between Sarah and Reuven. And if that be the case, then Rivka was never at Sarah's Erev. And that means that the Mishnah is impossible, right? Again, that all that is going to Ula. Let's rewind according to Rav Oshia. Rav Oshia works out very well, because Rav Oshia says that although there is miyun on Maimar, because Maimar is a Maisa Bidei Adam, a Maisa Kedushin, which the Rabbanan recognize, so you can have miyun on that. But there's no miyun on Zika, because Zika is Bidei Shamayim. And if that be the case, the miyun would have to take place before Shimon's death, in which case Sarah is being Mama'enes vis-a-vis Shimon, and then there was never a marriage with Shimon, and therefore there could be Yibum, or Midrabanan, they're not going to allow Yibum, but at least Chalitza would be an absolute requirement. So he summarizes this whole Shakamatariya in one small paragraph. He says, we kach shelo itira mishnah satsara elam came miyana erva b'chaye bylaw. We're only going to allow Rivka to be muteres. In other words, to have the status, at least as far as Yibum, of a tzaras erva. That's only if, I'm sorry, the other way around. We're only going to allow Rivka to fall for Yibum to Reuven and negate the status of tzaras erva. That's only because Sarah was Mama Enes during the lifetime of Shimon. Is Yesh Lochiach Kedivei Rav Oshia. This would only make sense in the light of Rav Oshia. Sha'af leBeis Hillel eina Mama Enes b'Zika. Again, emphasizing the fact that Zika is an Ishus Bidei Shamayim, and Miyun cannot be operative vis-a-vis Ishus Bidei Shamayim, only vis-a-vis Ishus Bidei Adam, which means that she would have had to be Mama Enesar against Shimon during Shimon's lifetime in order for that Miyun to be effective. Hence, our Mishnah says that whether or not Rivka is in fact a tsaras erva all depends upon the moment of death. And if at the moment of death there was no miyun, if there was no miyun, then what's going to happen is subsequent post-death, which means on the Zika, that's irrelevant. There's no miyun on Zika, it's B'nai Shemayim. And therefore, the tsaras erva is a tsaras erva. Therefore, they cannot be yibum. Even if we would train Sarah to be ma'enes post-humously of Shimon, it would not be an effective miyun because that's a miyun on a bidei shammai, an isha's bidei shammai. According to Ula, on the other hand, we can encourage her to be miyabin to the Yavam even after the death of Shimon, and she could be ma'enes to Ruvain because the miyun on the Zika will remove the isha's l'mafreya. But our Mishnah is a clear-cut proof to Rabbi Yosha. So the Gemara says, "Lo." We'll see if in 5 minutes we can get to the Mishnah. So tomorrow we start with the next Mishnah. There's no proof. The truth is, says the Gemara, there's miyun even on Zika. However, the miyun on Zika is not effective to be matir the tzara. Why? Tzaras erva shine. This has to do with rabbinic considerations and xeris and so forth and so on. That we're not going to recognize the miyun of a ketana to be matir tzara b'yibum. The Tani Rami Bar Yechezkel miana bebal muteres li aviv. That if a woman is mima'enes to her husband, she's allowed to marry the father of her husband, her former father-in-law. Now, that's called kaloso, which is clearly an erev. And the erev of kaloso applies even after a woman becomes an almana or a grusha. But nevertheless, the miyun is mater to a father-in-law because it's oker the kedushay haben limafreya. And she was never kalos. However, miana b'yavam, the brisa of Rami Bar Yechezkel insists that if she was mama'enes b'yavam, in other words, after her husband's death, asur liyavam, she cannot marry her former ex-father-in-law. Alma, what do we see from this brisa? That as a result of the marriage of the son, she falls for Yibum. And Mishas Nefila, at the moment that she falls for Yibum, before the Miyun, is Nireis Kekalosa. At that moment in time, she looked like the Kala, even though, again, the Miyun is Mafkia L'Mafreya. So she was never Kalosa. But yet, we're not going to allow her to marry the father, because there was no yibum during the lifetime of the son. The afal pishad mi and okeres kedusha ben lemafreya ein adover nirikein lebnei adam. The Rabbanan are worried about Xera. What does it look like in the eyes of the spectator? El yitu, they'll come to the mistaken conclusion shamiyun hu bezikas hayibu bilvad v'lo bekedusha rishona. Very strange halacha here. But again, this is the mindset of the spectator. He thinks that the miyun could be effective on Zika, but it's not effective on the marriage of the previous husband. And therefore, how can she be married to his father when the Torah prohibits the erev of kalos? So how does this entire Shakalatariya help us to reconcile our Mishnah with Ula? The Gemara says, Hachanami, here too, in the case of Tzaras Bitam and Ma'enes, even though as a result of the Miyun, we clarify that she was never the Tzara, meaning that Rivka was never a Tzaras Erva, we're worried about the mistake of the spectator. Mishas Nefila, before the Miyun actually took place, so there was, at this moment of Nefila, when Shimon died and she fell for Yibum, there was no Akiras Kiddushe Shimon Lamafreya, because right now there was no Miyun. Is therefore Mires Kitzaras Bita. If we focus on our attention on the attention of the spectators at the time of the Misa, before the Miyun actually took place, what we see is Sarah together with Rivka falling for Yibum to Ruvain, and therefore Sarah's status is that of an erva. Therefore, Rivka's status is that of a Sarah's erva. And therefore, if we're going to allow Yibum between Ruvain and Rivka, it's going to look like he's being miyabim Sarah's erva. So to avoid that situation, we're going to say that everything depends upon Shas Misa, and the miyun that takes place after Misa is not enough to allow Yibum to the Tzara, because in the eyes of the spectators, she is a Tzara's erva, because at that moment in time, when Shimon died, there was no miyun between Sarah and the Yavam and Ruth. Okay, so Mitzvah Hashem, tomorrow we start the next Mishnah. If you have the Masifta and you look at the next Mishnah, he's got 7 diagrams on the next Mishnah. But I'm not afraid of diagrams. You know, at the beginning when we started learning Masechet Yevamot, I was very petrified of diagrams. But now I see that if you learn the Gemara well, the diagrams could be a very fine aid, but you don't have to put all your faith. Al tiftachu b'diagrams. Okay then? So everyone should have a great day. And I'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place. Anyone who's able to come face to face is always invited. I won't promise I'll wear a mask. That I can't do. I can't teach with a mask.